I started the trail off in a one-person tent. I was using a tarp tent Aeon Lee, and I loved that tent. I bought it pretty much as soon as it was released, which was the summer before starting the Appalachian Trail, and I got it delivered to New Zealand, so I was able to practice setting it up and test it out a few times and be sure that I liked it before hitting the trail. Raiden also started in a one-person tent. He was using a Light Heart Gear solo tent, and he absolutely loves that tent. And then after a little while, we decided we wanted to move into a two-man tent. And I had a two-man Lanshan tent, which was with the rest of my stuff at a friend's house in Seattle. And so I asked him if he could send that to me, which he did. And we picked that up in Damascus and set out with the two-man tent from trail days onwards. With the two-man tent, we split it so that Raiden carried the fly and I carried the inner. For Raiden, it meant that he could reduce his tent weight a little bit. For me, it actually increased my tent weight a little bit because my previous tent was Dyneema, whereas this one was Sil Poly. The Appalachian Trail has shelters the whole way along it. There's actually about 260 shelters along the Appalachian Trail, which works out to be one every 8.5 miles. In reality, they're not spaced like that. Sometimes they're much closer together. There's some within a couple of miles of each other, and other stretches where they're much further apart. An Appalachian Trail shelter has got 3 walls and a roof, and then has a sleeping platform for everybody to sleep on. And people just line up their sleeping mats in a row and sleep with all their heads down one end, their feet at the other in a row. We only slept in shelters a couple of times on trail. Raiden slept in a shelter the very first night on trail before we met. But my first night in a shelter, I think, was day 4 or 5. We got to a shelter, it was going to rain all night, and it was big, and there was space, and so I decided to sleep in the shelter. Raiden opted to sleep in his tent, and he definitely made the better decision that night. The person who slept next to me, he snored, he took up a lot of room, and he set an alarm for something like 5:30 in the morning, then proceeded to pack up all his things really loudly, and he was still there when I got up at 7 or 7:30. It really irritated me. From that point onwards, we didn't really sleep in shelters very often. There was a couple of times that we opted to sleep in shelters. One that comes to mind was in the Whites, where the campsite that they allocated us was in a dip, and it was heavily raining and the dip flooded, so we moved to the shelter. And then we stayed in a few other indoor shelters on trail. We slept on the floor in the Lake of the Clouds hut in the Whites. We stayed in an old ranger cabin near a fire tower somewhere, and we stayed at what they called the Lookout Shelter, which was on private land and had a really cool crow's nest on top that you could see a 360-degree view from. At those shelters, we had lots of room. There was only a few people there, so we were able to spread out, and we got a really good night's sleep. At the start of the trail, we opted to camp near shelters most of the time. This meant that there was a good social aspect, as well as a picnic table to cook and eat your dinner at, a privy, and usually a water source of some sort. After we got sick, we opted to stay away from shelters a bit more, so that meant we would camp in a stealth camping spot somewhere near the trail. If we could, we'd do that near a stream so we had a water supply, or if we couldn't find that, we would pick up water and then carry it to our campsite. And that just meant that we would stop by shelters during the day to use the privy, to have lunch at the picnic table, or to wait out a storm or something like that. I also found that I missed the social aspect of the shelters a little bit, and so we made the effort to stay at shelters every now and then to allow for more socializing with other people, and I really enjoyed that. I'm not sure exactly how many times we stayed in town. I could probably figure it out if I went through my spreadsheet, but I haven't had a chance to do that. I'm guessing that on average we stayed in towns about once a week. This was probably more often at the start of the trail and less often near the end of the trail. When we stayed in towns, we stayed in hostels a few times near the start of the trail, or when no other accommodation was available. And then later on, we would split a hotel room because it was just as cost effective to do that. We also spent another few nights in towns at other accommodation, mainly being in churches. We stayed at the church bunk room in Damascus, And we also stayed in a church basement somewhere else. I can't think of the name. It was on Raiden's birthday. We stayed in a church basement that night. It had air conditioning, so we had a really, really good night's sleep. Another unusual place we slept one night was in a bathroom. It was in a park of some sort. There was a ranger station and a little store, and we actually got talking to one of the staff there, and they said something about some thunderstorms coming through that night, and then kind of jokingly said, well, you could always sleep in the bathrooms. And so we did. There was a bathroom with a toilet and shower and lots of open space. It was private. We were able to just go in and shut the door after the store was closed and most people had left for the day. We actually set up the inner of our tent inside the toilet, and that meant that we didn't have to sleep directly on the floor, and we had a fantastic night's sleep in there. Funnily enough, it didn't actually rain that night, or not very heavily anyway, so we probably would have been fine just camping out, but we had a great night's sleep, so I'm not upset about it at all. There's a few things to keep in mind when you're staying in shelters or camping on the Appalachian Trail, or really anywhere, to be honest. The first one, which is definitely about shelters, is that you shouldn't set up your tent inside the shelter. I understand that people do this because they want to set up the bug mesh from their tent so they can sleep in the shelter but not get eaten by mosquitoes. But really, if you're going to go to the effort of setting up the bug mesh of your tent, I think you should just set your tent up outside and leave the shelter with all the room for other people to stay in. The thing about the shelters is that everybody lies next to each other, and by setting up your tent, you're taking up a lot of room and kind of putting up a weird barrier between you and other people. I think it impacts the social aspect of staying in a shelter quite a lot. By staying in a mesh tent, you're taking up potentially 2 or 3 people's worth of space in a shelter, and you never know what the situation's going to be throughout the evening as more people arrive. So I think it's really important to consider those around you, and if you want to sleep in your tent further away from the shelter. It's also important when you stay in a shelter to keep your things contained. It's very easy when you get to camp to have what I like to call a pack explosion, where you just empty everything out of your pack when you're looking for things. But it's really important in the shelters to then pack your things up, condense down, not take up more room than you need to, because there's a small space being shared by a lot of people. Another thing to keep in mind when camping or staying in shelters is hike at midnight. So hike at midnight is generally accepted to be around 9 p.m. It's a time when most thru-hikers are going to bed so they can get enough sleep to have another long day of hiking. If you're awake in camp after hike at midnight, then it's time to just start talking a little bit quieter. If you're arriving in camp after hike at midnight, it's really important to try and set up camp quietly and to try not disturb people as much as possible. One of the best ways to try and avoid disturbing people after hike at midnight is by using a red lamp on your headlamp. Most people carry a headlamp that has a bright white light, which is absolutely fantastic for when you're actually hiking in the dark. But if you're around camp after dark, a red light is really useful for doing evening chores such as cooking your dinner and working in your tent. Red light's great because it won't affect your night vision and won't affect the night vision of other people around you, which means if you shine your red light on somebody else's tent, not only is it less likely to go through the tent and light up their tent, the light that does reach them is less likely to affect them. Comparing that to shining a white light on somebody's tent, it will make the whole inside of their tent light up like a lantern and disturb their sleep. So I really recommend, if you're looking for a headlamp, you make sure you get one that has red light and white light, so you can do night hiking efficiently, but also be considerate around camp.